The rain pounded against the massive windows of Charles Whitmore's estate, each drop tapping like a ghostly whisper against the glass. Inside, the warmth of the grand chandelier bathed the luxurious living room in a golden glow. Everything about the space screamed wealth. Italian leather sofas, priceless paintings, the softest Persian rugs money could buy. But none of it could shield him from the cold truth that was about to unfold. Charles sat comfortably in his custom-made armchair, a glass of aged whiskey resting in his hand, swirling lazily as he stared at his son, Ethan, who stood rigidly across the room. For years, Charles had built an empire from the ground up, turning his once small business into a global giant. He had everything: money, influence, power. The world saw him as a man who had conquered life itself. Yet, at this very moment, he felt powerless. Ethan, his only son, the heir to everything, had always been the quiet one. Unlike Charles, who thrived in boardrooms and negotiations, Ethan preferred solitude. He spent more time lost in his books and art rather than in business meetings. It had always been a silent battle between them, one trying to mold the other into his image, and the other resisting with everything he had. But tonight was different. There was something in Ethan's eyes Charles had never seen before, a mix of determination and pain, as if the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. He took a deep breath, his fingers clenching into fists, before he finally spoke. "Dad." Ethan's voice trembled slightly, but he forced himself to continue. "I have to tell you something. Something I should have said a long time ago." Charles raised an eyebrow, more curious than concerned. "Go on." Ethan hesitated, staring at his father, searching for the right words. And then, with a voice that barely rose above a whisper, he said it. The moment the words left Ethan's lips, Charles felt the air sucked out of the room. His heart slammed against his chest, the glass slipping from his fingers and shattering against the marble floor. The sound rang through the silence like a gunshot. His mind raced, trying to process what he had just heard. He had faced ruthless competitors, hostile takeovers, and financial collapses, but nothing had prepared him for this. Nothing. Ethan's confession was not just painful. It was a wound deep enough to shatter the illusion Charles had spent a lifetime building. It was the kind of truth that made a man question everything he thought he knew. Charles tried to speak, but no words came. His throat felt tight, his limbs frozen. He wanted to deny it, to argue, to demand answers. But deep down, he already knew. He had seen the signs, ignored them, buried them beneath expectations and pride. And now, standing before him, was the undeniable proof that his world would never be the same again. Ethan looked at him, waiting, hoping, but Charles just sat there, paralyzed, not by weakness, but by the weight of a truth he could no longer escape. And then silence. A silence that stretched long enough to change everything. The silence stretched between them like a canyon, vast and unbridgeable. Charles sat frozen, his breath shallow, his fingers twitching against the armrest of his chair. The weight of Ethan's words hung in the air, suffocating, heavy. His mind reeled, trying to piece together the shattered fragments of what he had just heard. It didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense. Ethan, his son, his only son, had just spoken a truth that rewrote everything Charles thought he knew. It was like a crack running through the foundation of a building, small at first, but deep enough to bring the whole structure crashing down. He wanted to demand answers, to argue, to tell Ethan he was wrong. But the look in his son's eyes stopped him. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't rebellion. It was something far worse. It was pain. Ethan wasn't trying to hurt him. He was hurting. And Charles, the man who had built an empire from nothing, had no idea how to fix this. The fire in the grand fireplace crackled softly, filling the room with a warmth that felt completely out of place. Charles let out a slow breath, leaning forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "How long?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "Does it matter?" Charles felt something sharp twist inside his chest. He had always been the man with the answers, the one people turned to in times of crisis. Yet here he was, grasping at words like a drowning man, reaching for air. Charles hesitated, running a hand down his face. "I need to understand." Ethan let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "That's the thing, Dad. You never tried to understand." Charles flinched, as if struck. He wanted to argue, to defend himself. But the truth was, Ethan was right. He had always been so focused on building his empire, securing their future, making sure his son had everything he never did. But in doing so, had he ever truly listened? Had he ever really seen Ethan for who he was, rather than who he wanted him to be? Ethan looked away, his hands gripping the edge of his jacket, as if holding himself together. "Do you know what it was like growing up in this house, feeling like no matter what I did, it would never be enough? You wanted a reflection of yourself, a successor, someone to carry on your name, your legacy. But that's not who I am." Charles's stomach twisted. He had always believed he was preparing Ethan for greatness, pushing him because he wanted the best for him. But had it felt different to Ethan? Had it felt like a cage instead? "I gave you everything," Charles said quietly, though there was no anger in his voice, only exhaustion. "No, Dad," Ethan whispered. "You gave me expectations, and every time I failed to meet them, I felt like I was failing you." The "yes" word struck deep, deeper than Charles wanted to admit. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, another voice cut through the tension. "Sir!" Both men turned. William, the Whitmore family's longtime butler, stood in the doorway, his face unreadable. He had been with them for years, had seen every side of this family. The victories, the losses, the things left unsaid. Now he simply glanced between father and son before clearing his throat. "There's a call for you, sir," William said, carefully, looking at Charles. "It's urgent." Charles barely registered the words. He wanted to send the call away, to stay in this moment and finally face the truth between him and Ethan. But something in William's expression made him pause. "Who is it?" William hesitated. "Mr. Patterson, from the board." Charles's spine stiffened. Patterson was one of his most trusted business partners. If he was calling at this hour, it wasn't good. With one last glance at Ethan, Charles stood up, his head spinning as he walked toward his office. He needed a moment, just a moment, to clear his head before he completely lost himself. Ethan watched him go, his chest tight, his hands shaking. He should have known this was how it would end. His father had spent his whole life prioritizing business over family. Why would now be any different? But just as Charles reached the doorway, he hesitated. His fingers hovered over the doorframe, his posture tense. He didn't turn around, didn't say anything. But for a brief second, Ethan saw it, the hesitation, the conflict. And then, without another word, Charles disappeared down the hallway. Ethan let out a slow, shaky breath, staring at the spot where his father had just stood. He wanted to believe things would change, that maybe this time his father would finally see him. But deep down, he wasn't sure if Charles ever truly would. And that was the part that hurt the most. Suspense is building, and the tension between father and son is at its peak. The question now remains, will Charles truly change, or will he let his legacy continue to come between them? Ethan sat motionless in the vast, quiet room, the weight of everything he had just confessed pressing down on him. He had finally said the words that had been locked inside him for years. But instead of relief, all he felt was emptiness. His father had walked away, again. The fire crackled softly in the background, filling the silence that stretched between him and the shattered glass on the floor. He let out a slow breath, pressing his hands against his temples. Maybe he had been foolish to think things would be different. Maybe expecting his father to truly hear him was just another false hope. Meanwhile, Charles stood in his office, gripping the edge of his mahogany desk. His phone lay face up in front of him, Patterson's name flashing on the screen. But he didn't answer. He couldn't. His mind was too consumed by the last thing Ethan had said. "You never tried to understand." It played over and over in his head, like an echo he couldn't escape. He had spent his life building an empire, but had he lost something far more valuable in the process? His hands clenched into fists. He had always believed success was the answer to everything, that if he provided Ethan with the best education, the best life, the best opportunities, then that was enough. But now, for the first time, he wondered if he had been blind all along. The call went to voicemail, the screen dimming. Charles exhaled sharply and turned back toward the hallway. He didn't know what he was going to say, didn't know if he even had the right words. But for the first time in his life, he was willing to try. Ethan was still staring at the fire when he heard footsteps behind him. He didn't turn around, didn't expect much. But then, his father spoke, and his voice was different this time. Lower, softer. "I stayed away because I was afraid of what I didn't understand." Ethan blinked, his hands tightening around his sleeves. He slowly turned, meeting his father's eyes. For once, there was no pride, no authority, no businesslike detachment, just a man who looked tired, maybe even lost. "I thought I was protecting you," Charles continued, his jaw tight, as if the words were difficult to admit. "I thought pushing you, shaping you into someone strong, would prepare you for the world. I never saw how much it was breaking you." Ethan swallowed hard, emotions clawing at his throat. "You weren't protecting me. You were protecting yourself. You didn't want a son who was different." Charles closed his eyes for a second, then nodded. "Maybe I didn't. Because it meant facing something I didn't know how to fix." He hesitated before adding, "But I don't want to lose you, Ethan." Ethan searched his father's face, looking for the usual dismissal, the usual avoidance. But for the first time, it wasn't there. There was no quick escape, no walking away, just honesty. It wasn't everything. It didn't erase the years of silence, of pain, of feeling unseen. But maybe it was a start. Ethan let out a slow, shaky breath. "I don't need you to fix me. I just need you to see me." Charles nodded. "I'm trying." For the first time in years, the tension between them didn't feel like a battlefield. It felt like the beginning of something neither of them quite understood. But for once, they were willing to figure it out together. The fire crackled beside them, the storm outside beginning to fade. And though nothing was perfect, for the first time in a long time, there was hope.